Comfort in Northern Australia session. So as you would have been aware, the session is being recorded. So if you do need to head off, that's fine. You will be sent a recording of this afterwards. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Emily Hinds. I'm the climate mate for the Northern Territory, or Climate Extension Officer for the Northern Australian Climate Program based in Darwin, and represent the Northern Territory. We have had over or around 80 people register for this event, so it's very popular, and I thank you all for getting involved. We've got some really great speakers, so I also thank them for their time today. Through this session, we're hoping that you will get access to the actual product and why it was developed, what kind of events initiated the research, and having a look at some of those events and setting them up against our cattle comfort index product that we have, and then looking at some outcomes and some of the effects of cattle on these different events, extreme events, and some potential herd management practices. But we also encourage you guys to share with us, because obviously we're not running cattle, we're in research mostly and extension. So if there are examples that you've had on property, we can keep it all confidential, where you've had effects on cattle from these extreme events. We'd love to hear from you. There will be plenty of opportunities to ask questions throughout, but we do ask that those are typed into the chat. So you've got either the chat option if you're not that great with technology, but if you do know your Q&A button, it appears at the bottom of your screen there with a little question mark in it. You might be able to find it under the More button with the three dots and the circle to get that up, and you can post them in there. And at the end, we will go through those questions. We do have an hour for this session, but we can also just extend it over just to get those questions answered. Otherwise, we'll export the chat and send an answer to you directly. So thanks again. Our first speaker is Professor John Gaugham from the University of Queensland, and he's going to start by talking about why the product was developed and what initiated the research. So yeah, we encourage questions as we go along, and if they're pertinent to what's being presented at the time, I'll ask them. Otherwise, just at the end of the session. All right. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Emily. So everything's clear from your end? You can see it okay?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Yes, so I'm John Gaugham. I'm based at the University of Queensland at Gatton, and I've sort of been working in this space of heat stress and I guess climate stress for quite a number of years. So what I thought I'd just do briefly as an intro to what Tim will be talking about after this is why we sort of developed these assessment models and how they sort of came about. So if we look at some of the historical events that have happened, and they're not all in Australia, obviously, but the first big one that happened was in February 1999, and that was down in southeast Queensland at Texas, and over 4,000 cattle died in that event, mostly in feedlots. But there was also grazing cattle that died across species, so both Bos taurus and Bos indicus. A number of horses died, something like 20,000 chickens died, and some farm dogs also died during that event. And it wasn't particularly hot. It was low 30s, but very high humidity, low wind speed, no cloud cover, and so just quite a high heat load on those animals. And that was really the first one that I ever got involved with, and from then on, my interest just kept moving on in this space. February 2000 was another big event in southwestern New South Wales, and again it was mostly feedlot cattle, around about 1,200 of those animals, and this was also driven by high rainfall events, so very high humidity, low wind speed. But one of the key things that came out of this for us was this high overnight temperature, and it was one of the first times we actually saw nighttime temperature as a driving force in some of these heat load events. There was a number of other events between February 2000 and the June 2022 event, but I just want to quickly touch on that one. So this was one in the US where officially 2,000 animals died, but the unofficial number was about 15,000. Again, not high temperatures, only mid to low 30s. But again, high solar exposure. A lot of these animals had no shade, low wind speed. So to feel like temperature in that case was actually 50 degrees. And it was one of the first big death events that we were involved with, where we actually had on-site weather data from a number of feedlots. So it helped us a lot in determining some of the things we were looking at. Now, obviously, we're talking, a lot of this is around feedlot animals. The impacts on Australian grazing cattle, particularly in the northern tropics, is a little bit more difficult to measure because of lack of suitable livestock data. However, we do have some information on this, which will be discussed a bit later in the webinar by Kieran. I guess a lot of the focus has traditionally been on heat stress, and that's still an issue, but there's also cold stress, and that's one of the things that we've incorporated as well, which Tim will talk about. But just as a couple of examples, January last year, there was an oppressive long weekend. We had a lot of feedlot mortalities in southeast Queensland. Again, it was around about 3,000. And again, also in that event, grazing cattle died as well. 80 cows died in 2014 from heat stress in Victoria, and these were grazing animals. And of course, we had the big events in northern Queensland in February 2019, and we also had multiple deaths in coastal Queensland following Cyclone Oswald. And these weren't heat-driven events. They were more of a cold event. But I'll talk more about that a little bit later, because there's some other issues we have to think about around that. So it was these ideas that we had these events coming through. Can we actually do any predictions around these events before they happen? And if we can predict them, what can we do to try to alleviate some of the impact that this will have on production of our cattle? So Tim put together a paper last year where looking at a number of historical cattle heat events, and these weren't all feedlot animals, but you can see from this table, if you can see it okay, that there were some Brahman cross and Brahman cattle and Droughtmaster cattle, which typically would say are heat tolerant, that have also died during some of these heat events. So from that, and also some of the anecdotal evidence from producers, is that it's not just the Bos Taurus cattle that are susceptible to heat, and we need to take into consideration that the Bos Indicus animals can also be affected in a much smaller way, but they can also be affected. And the other thing to keep in mind also is as we move more and more cattle, Bos Taurus cattle, particularly Angus and black cattle, into the north, then the likelihood of some of these events hitting is increased. So just quickly then to lead into what's been developed. Typically, what's been used is what's called the temperature humidity index, THI. And the THI was developed back in the late 1950s, early 1960s, primarily for housed cattle, dairy and beef. And it's also used for pigs and poultry. So housed animals, the THI works really well. It's not appropriate, though, for outdoor assessment because it doesn't take into account the impact of sun, so solar load or solar radiation, or wind speed on cattle comfort. And it also assumes that all animals are the same, which we know is not the case. So the temperature humidity index didn't really help us in determining what the likely impact of an up-and-coming heat event would be on our livestock. So we developed with MLA funding the heat load index, or HLI, which was primarily aimed at feedlot cattle. And it's now being used across the feedlot sector in Australia. It's also being used in Argentina and in Brazil. So what the HLI does, it combines the effects of temperature, relative humidity and solar radiation and wind speed into a single index, which gives us an indicator then of what the heat load effect is on those animals. And if you think about solar radiation or solar load, if you're standing in shade, it might be 35 degrees, but if you actually go and stand out in the sun, that sun effect can push that temperature up to 45 degrees or even more. So solar load plays a really important part, even if there's shade, because there's always some radiant heat coming off the ground. So the heat load index worked really well for feedlot animals. And a colleague of mine in the US, Professor Nader, we talked about another index that could actually combine the effects of heat and cold. So if you look at the continuum from cold conditions to hot conditions, the HLI only looked at the hot conditions and not the possible impact of cold conditions. So from that, we developed what's called the Cattle Comfort Index, or the CCI, and this spans those cold and warm or hot extremes, and it also combines solar radiation, humidity, and wind speed. And we think it's probably more appropriate for grazing situations, and it was more aimed at that type of situation. Both this HLI and the CCI, the thresholds where we think heat load starts to accumulate or abate, can be adjusted, and this is another thing the THI cannot do. So these models can actually adjust the base based on animal type, animal performance level, management, nutritional, health status, a whole range of things like that. So both these all three of these indexes are being used to assess the heat load on cattle in the north. And Tim will now talk about how this has all come together. So Tim, I'll pass over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, John. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Let me just stop sharing.
I can hear you.
Fantastic. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, from the Bureau of Meteorology, where I'm currently based, but I'm a University of Southern Queensland person at the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences. So I just get my presentation up. Just bear with me.
So Dr. Tim Cowan, he works for the Northern Australian Climate Program as a research fellow and the manager of our research program. And he first became interested in this Cattle Comfort Index with probably discussions with John Gaugham, but it was initially the 2019 events in Queensland, the flooding, that you really got into it, Tim, and started looking into this work that you've been doing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for that, Emily. Hopefully you can see my presentation okay. Just give us a shout out if you can.
That's fine.
Fantastic. Yeah, so John gave a really great intro to the CCI and some of the other indices that we use to monitor and predict the comfort levels of cattle and sheep as well. So sort of want to touch on what John talked about, some of these historic events that we've encountered in the past, and sort of answers that question of, well, why do we need a cattle comfort forecast product? So there's been numerous events, and a lot of them have been in the past sort of 5 to 6 years, and they've gained a lot of media attention. So you can see some of these events on the left there. You've got two monsoon sort of depression events, one in March 2023 in the northwest Queensland, where there was 50,000 head of cattle lost, and another in January in the Kimberley. Again, tens of thousands of livestock presumably lost. So it's these events of late where we've seen, say, monsoon depressions or tropical cyclones, that these systems have come through, and there's been a deluge, and some of these systems have seemingly stalled in one place, and that's been that set the right conditions for cattle to be impacted. John also mentioned some of these big heat stress events that have occurred. So that one in 1991, which killed over 4,000 cattle in southern Queensland and northern New South Wales. There's a one from last year, so January 2024, around the Australia Day long weekend, where we saw really quite humid, hot conditions, really, really warm nighttime temperatures. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the potential to forecast those types of events. And the big one that sort of got me into this area of research was that those floods in northwest Queensland in 2019, and that came off the back of record warm temperatures from November, December 2018, all the way through to the end of January 2019, followed by this monsoon depression and rapid switch in the temperature. So what is currently available to producers, and when I say what is available, what I mean is what is currently freely available to the public. So on the left there is an image from an article talking about the sheep graziers warning. So this is something which is available to us in the southern regions. I think it does extend up into parts of southern central Queensland, but this is based on what we call the livestock chill index, and when it reaches certain thresholds, then the Bureau put out these sheep graziers warnings. So you might have seen them if you're in the southern states. You might have seen them on the news, and often it just means that they tend to be more in line with winter conditions being quite cold, quite chilly. And on the right-hand side is the heat wave sort of product that the Bureau produces, and this is a static map that gets updated, I think, every day or two, and it shows the sort of 3-day heat conditions for the next week. And going on that, the Bureau are actually about to release a 7-day heat wave forecast product, which is more dynamic as opposed to just static maps. So it's sort of a bit like the tropical cyclone warning maps that you see. This will be something that you can cycle through and see how the heat is changing in the next 7 days. So that's what's currently available to everyone. So what we wanted to do was use the research that John and others have produced and provide a freely available prototype product showing the CCI and other thermal stress metrics going out to at least the 7-day forecast period. There are other places where this is currently in action. So this is just a map of Oklahoma in the US, and they have a similar forecast product. So this is the state of Oklahoma, and it's showing, this is, I think, 2 days ago, showing the current conditions being at the sort of midwinter. You can see the temperatures there in Fahrenheit are very, very cold, and that's sort of suggesting that much of Oklahoma is in the cold caution to cold danger threshold for cattle. So this is updated every 6 hours by the Mesonet group, and they have forecasts that go out to about 3.5 days. The good thing about this sort of product is that the user can select a certain station, and once they click on it, it shows you an hour-by-hour breakdown of what's happened in the past, say, 10 days or so, and then what's going to happen in the next 3 to 4 days. So this leads me to discuss the products that we've developed as part of the North Australian Climate Program. So this is in partnership with the Bureau and UniSQ. So we have taken the forecasts from the Bureau's deterministic numerical weather prediction model. It's called Access G3, so the G is global, and 3 being the third version of this model. So what we have is a model which produces forecasts every 6 hours or so at a resolution of about 12.5 kilometres. So that's saying every grid cell in this model is about 12.5 kilometres wide or long. So it's quite a detailed numerical weather prediction system. So what we do is we take these forecasts, of air temperature, wind speed, relative humidity, and solar radiation, and we put it through an algorithm, and then we produce forecasts of heat load index, which John mentioned, the cattle comfort index, so the CCI, and also the temperature humidity index, so THI. And what I'm showing you here is just some static maps of each of those products. So the heat load index on the left, the CCI on the right. and the THI, sorry, the CSI in the middle and the THI on the right-hand side. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and show you what the forecasts currently look like and how to navigate through the website. So hopefully this will work. And if you want to, what we say, play along at home, you can, I assume it should work. If you Google cattle thermal stress forecasts, you should see the NACP page come up with the cattle thermal stress forecasts.
You can also visit our webpage, which is
there we go. Thank you very much.
.nacp.org.au, which is now on the chat.
Can you see the forecast map up there from the webpage? Hopefully.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Fantastic. So yeah, so you go to that link and it comes up with this page. So this is our forecast page for the CCI, the THI, and the heat load index. So these are updated every day at around about, I think it's around about 8 o'clock Queensland time, so Australian Eastern Standard Time. And what it shows is the conditions at that particular hour in the forecast. You can cycle through every 3 hours. So we don't show every hour of the forecast out to 10 days. We just show you what the conditions are like every 3 hours. So this is what I'm showing on the screen now is the forecast for 10 a.m. Queensland time from today, Thursday, 20th of February. And this is the CCI, so the Cattle Comfort Index. And you can see that what we've done is we've sort of split up the CCI into sort of three main levels. So you have the hot conditions by the sort of yellow, orangey, pink colors. The sort of middle, neutral, bland colors are your sort of moderate to mild temperatures. And then the blue to dark blue, so light to dark blue are your colder CCI cattle comfort conditions. So what we can do is you can press the play button and it just cycles through every 3 hours now from today through to about 9 or 10 days time. So you can see as you go through each day, you can see the colors go from red to milder blue as you go to the nighttime and then go back into warmer conditions once the sun returns. So you can see some pretty cool features. So in the southwest, you see obviously a cold front went through. You see warm conditions sort of remain up north through most of the days, getting sort of well into the 40s in terms of the CCI. You can see going into next week, looks like Victoria might be a little bit warmer. And then you can just pause at any stage. If you don't want to wait for the forecast to reach a certain stage, you can just grab the cursor yourself and run through. And good thing about this feature is you can change how long each forecast stays on the screen when you play it. So you can change that from 1 second to 5 seconds if you want to get a better idea of what's on the cards in the next week or so. If you're after more information about this particular forecast, if you just go below, there's a bit of a summary about what the CCI encompasses. So how we create it. So as John mentioned, it incorporates relative humidity, solar radiation, and wind speed, and they're all sort of combined as an adjustment to the air temperature. And then we have some thresholds here for cattle, and these are based on the field work that John's done back with his colleagues in the University of Nebraska in the US. One thing you might notice is that the warm conditions, they seem to make sense to us coming from quite a warm, dry continent. But if you look at the cool and cold thresholds, you're seeing that if it gets below minus 10 degrees, that's what's considered extreme. But we know that, say, in the tropics, in the far northern tropics, or even in the subtropics, that's pretty rare to get those sort of temperatures. And that's where the work of my colleague Rachel Taylor is going to be really crucial, because we're currently working on trying to better understand the thresholds for different parts of Australia. So we know, say, for those floods in 2019 in February up in northwest Queensland. We know that cattle were severely affected by the chill conditions, but we also know that the temperatures didn't get down to below 0 degrees, even when you factor in relative humidity, the lack of solar irradiance, and the high wind speeds. So this is where more research needs to be done to understand the seasonal changes in the thresholds. And there's some more, and on this same page, you've got some more information about these thermal stress forecasts and about the model itself. So one thing I want to flag as well is that there's a provide feedback button here. And what this does is that if you have any feedback whatsoever about these products, whether it be that you want to see different colors, if you don't agree with the colors, or you think something else could be added, some more information, then that's what this provide feedback button is for. So as you can see, it is a prototype, and we are more than happy to take all and any feedback, because it's only through that feedback and through the engagement with producers that we can actually produce a better product, or one which has more meaning. And just while I'm there, I did show in my slide pack that we have we create a THI and a heat load index forecast. So these, if you click on those, they also come up. It's a good way to sort of do a check, as in if you know that there's a heat wave possibly coming your way and you want to get a sense of what the THI is showing. You might be more familiar with that as an index because it's been around for a lot longer than the heat load index and the CCI. That's one way to sort of just compare the forecasts. Likewise, we have the heat load index as well, which John mentioned. So it's only looking at those warm extremities. And one thing I won't go into today, but feel free to go through this at your own time and your own leisure, is the accumulated heat load unit, which is based on the heat load index itself, and it describes the accumulation of heat in an animal across time. And when you look at that, you can change it up based on the type of, or the breed of cattle that you're interested in. So if you're interested in Brahman, then it changes the sort of the thresholds for that particular breed. Because we know that if you choose Angus, there are very few Angus that are up in the top end. And so you can see that sort of forecast would not be as relevant for that region. Okay,
Even so,
all right.
Tim, I did want to ask, first of all, you've only got 2 minutes left, but
Fantastic.
for those that are looking at home, and this is where I think the questions will be, they see a lot of that deep purple, maroon colours. Should they be worried then? I mean, this is today, 20th of February. What were the outcomes? And I know John will talk on it a little bit more, but what would be your advice for using this?
So if you're referring to the CCI, so as I mentioned when I first went onto this webpage, is that these are hourly forecasts. So it's for that particular hour. It's not a daily average forecast. So you can see that at any particular hour, it might be that one region is forecasting, say, 45 degrees, but that it might be for that afternoon period. So to get a sense of what's happening across the forecast period, it's good to look across the day or across maybe a few days to get a sense of how long that heat is hanging around for. So
thank you.
I'll quickly go back to my slide pack, and I'll just briefly mention the verification of the forecast. And we did a verification. Well, I say verification, but we did a sort of a fairly quick check of the forecast for last year's Australia Day weekend heatwave across southern Queensland. And we know that, as I mentioned earlier, that the minimum temperature, the nighttime temperatures were quite extreme. In fact, they were record breaking. So what we did is we went back and looked at the forecast from this model for the cattle comfort index. And what I'm showing you here is what we call a time series. So this is 20th of January here, and this is 31st of January. And between these two vertical lines is when the heat stress was recorded. And this black line here is the observed CCI from University of Queensland Gatton. So there's a really good bureau station there, which has fantastic meteorological measurements. So you can see it goes up and down. It went past the extreme threshold quite early on, like sort of in the 20th, 21st, and 22nd of January, and then it dipped into the sort of high 20s and then came back above 40 during that heat stress event. What the colours are showing are the forecasts from our model, our Access G3 model. So the yellow colours are the earlier forecasts. So it's when we started the forecasts back on the 20th. And as I said, they go out to about 10 days. And as you get into the orange and redder colours, they're the later, what we call initialised forecasts. And you'd expect them to match much closer to what actually was observed. So you can see some of the earlier forecasts from back on the 20th, 21st, 22nd of January. You can see they ended up underestimating the severity of the event. And the reason they underestimated severity of the event is because after about 5 days or so, it's really hard to get an accurate forecast of wind speeds and relative humidity. And also, as you probably know, if you've ever looked at a weather forecast of rainfall going out beyond 5 days, it can be extremely tricky. So you can see here where we have a dip in the CCI, where the model suggested it was going to be extreme. The reason the model got that wrong was because there was a rain event which the model didn't quite forecast accurately. So in saying that, I'll finish up there, Emily, and I'll just leave this up here. This is just a summary of where to find the product, some information about the skills so far in our really initial assessment, and our plans for 2025. And one of our plans is to release a livestock chill index forecast. So that goes with the sheep graziers warning, and also to make some further updates to these products based on any feedback we get. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this is a forecast from about 6 days ago. 6 days ago, when tropical cyclone Zelia was coming down the northwest coast, and it crossed near De Grey Station. And you can see here, this is the forecast from the 14th at 4 p.m. Queensland time, and you can actually see the impact of, the forecast impact of that tropical cyclone. So where you'd normally see temperatures up around in the 30s or 40s, or the CCIs in the 40 degrees, you can see that this tropical cyclone lowered those CCIs to between 10 and, say, 15 degrees. So that's just one example of how you can look at a particular weather event and get a sense of what the cattle comfort conditions are going to be like. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. There is a couple of questions that have popped up in the Q&A, so we'll get to those at the end. We are over the halfway mark, so we now have Professor John Gaugham and Dr. Kieran McCosker again, and they're going to present on outcomes and effects on cattle, because we have this forecast prototype product, but we need to know, how do we use that information and what sort of things can we do to counteract that and maybe make some management decisions pre-events. So welcome back, John and Kieran.
Thank you. I'll just get my slides up.
I do have a question I could ask now, or we're just waiting for John to get sorted. But how long does it need to be the dark purple or the extreme heat conditions until we get worried or see deaths, considering it's a 3-hourly forecast? So, maybe some assumptions around how long does it need to be, that purple, if we see 24 hours of per week in that dark purple, or is that something that we're going to need more research and more actual events and cattle effects?
You want me to answer that?
You can both
Sure.
have a crack at that.
Go for it, John.
Yeah, it's a good question. The short answer is we're not 100% sure because there's lots of confounding factors, which I'll sort of touch on in a moment. So I'll just sort of start with this, and I'll try to answer that question as I go through this. One of the things to keep in mind is that THI, HLI, and CCI are spot measures in time. And so it doesn't really matter that much that the CCI is 40 at 10 o'clock in the day. It's really what happens over the next 24 hours, 48 hours. So we need to think about the longer term exposure to the animals. Do they have time to recover from the purple zone or not? So it could get up to, you could have a very high CCI, HLI, THI every day for 30 or 40 days. But if they can drop some of that heat out at night, it's not so bad. So it's about the heat gain and heat loss, and that's where the accumulated heat load comes in. And so the accumulated heat load is allowing you to determine how much heat those animals have actually gained or how much they've lost over, and it's like a running average over 24 hours, 48 hours, etc. So you really need to be thinking about all these indices as not so much a spot measure in time, but how are they changing over time? What's the actual change? Are they getting hotter, cooler? Do cattle have time to cool off? Do they not have time to cool off if it's hot? If we get cold conditions, do they have time? Are they able to actually gain any of that heat back through nutrition or whatever it might be? So it's a bit of a complex question. We don't have all the answers for it yet, but it's something we are working on, and Kieran might touch a little bit on that during his, I'm not quite sure. But one thing I do want to say is that when we start to look at any of these indices and determining whether we have a problem or might have a problem, there's no single answer because there's so many other things going on and which you cannot look at in isolation. So yes, they might be hot or they might be cold, but there's other factors. There could be nutritional limitations, water limitations, health status, pregnancy status. There's a whole range of things like that we also need to consider. And they will change how animals are going to respond to those environmental conditions. So a purple could be bad for my cattle because they're in poor condition, but for yours, it may not be an issue if they're in good condition. So we need to think about not just looking at the temperature and the humidity and solar radiation, but all the other factors that impact on the performance of those animals. So breed type comes into that as well. There was an interesting paper that was published from MLA Henderson in 2013 where they looked at factors affecting breeder mortality in the north. And one of the things that came out of that was this statement that the wet, cooler and boggy conditions coupled with poor feed and physical weaknesses may result in increased mortalities. And that's one thing that we do see is that during those conditions that the likelihood of mortalities does go up. So that's being driven not by it being wet and cool necessarily, but by the extra energy those animals have to expend under boggy conditions. They've got poor feed, they're in poor body condition, and they're basically just weak. And in the US, they talk about this cattle syndrome, cattle weakness syndrome, where they just run out of energy over time. And that's one of the things we think happened in the 2019 event was really this, that cattle were in poor condition, they had no metabolic heat production, and they just weren't able to generate enough heat to survive those conditions. But as Tim said, weren't really that cold. But we had Brahman cattle here at Gatton that were shivering in one of the events that came through. So yeah, it's a complicated question. The answer is complicated, and yeah, we've just got a bit more to go in this area. I want to sort of touch on, and I'm quite happy to have more discussion with people around that topic. Just a couple of things, and this is getting back to this multiple stressor sort of thing to think about. So now we talk about Brahmins as being heat resilient, which they are, and we know they're very good at handling the hot conditions. But it doesn't mean the heat doesn't have an impact on them, and it has an impact on the female in a number of ways. If we look at the heat load, if we've got heat load, which is the red arrows, high heat can lead to decreased feed intake, which causes negative energy balance, which then decreases some of the reproductive hormones that these animals have. Heat load can also compromise the uterine environment because there'll be a shift of blood away from the uterus to the body surfaces for cooling. If we follow the blue lines through, we get decreased estradiol secretion, there's poor estrus expression. Again, the uterine environment's compromised, and we end up seeing lower fertilization rates, poor embryo quality, and embryonic loss. So if the cow's in good condition body-wise, then her ability to withstand that heat, not just in terms of her ability to be resilient to the heat, but also her ability to be reproductively resilient is quite important. So again, multiple things happening. It's not just the heat that drives this. There's other factors that are going on there as well. We can say the same thing about bulls. One of the issues that sort of is coming out now more and more is that the male fertility is probably going to be affected much longer term than the female. There's been some studies that have shown that the sperm can be permanently damaged in the bull, even though the sperm may look completely normal. Pregnancies are compromised, embryos are not viable. And one of the things that people have talked about is this DNA damage to the sperm, and that comes about typically from an acute heat stress event. And that can be even something like transport, not just heat out in a paddock situation. So again, multiple things happening in that space.
Sorry, John, it's almost time, or it is time.
I've only got one slide to go. The other thing to keep in mind is that not all animals are the same. So this was some work that was published 2 years ago, and it was looking at heat sensitive and heat tolerant bulls, both drought masters, and quite a bit of variation in terms of the sperm morphology. So the red bull not as good as the green bull. And just the final thing to say is, and Dr. McCosker is going to go into this in more detail, but looking at heat stress in calves, keep in mind that a Bos indicus calf, when it's born, so the first 7 to 10 days of its life, its thermoregulatory capacity is not very good. So it acts very much like an Angus calf would in that same environment. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so Kieran, over to you.
Thanks, John. And hopefully we'll have more time to discuss this when we get into the Q&A session as well, and open it up to some questions from the audience or anecdotal evidence from their properties.
Okay, thanks, John. Can you hear me all at the moment? Can someone confirm, please?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you. So, thanks, John, for that introduction. I just thought I'd continue on, and this is some work that was done by some researchers in Brazil. And John alluded to some of the reproduction issues, and my presentation today is to draw on projects that we've completed with the support of Northern Territory Department and Meat and Livestock Australia and Australian Agricultural Company. But the point of this slide was that you've earlier seen John's talk where he's talking about temperature humidity index and the animal impacts of that. So this was some work done from Brazil, which I mentioned before, in beef cattle, and it was about providing artificial shade in those production systems there. So this was following the temperature of following the weather conditions of cattle, and you can see there the THI over basically a 70-day period ranged between 79 and 80. So relatively low, but exceeding those critical thresholds. But the point of this slide here is to show that on the highest period, the average was a THA of 80 between day 28 and 42, which I've color-coded there, corresponds to a rise in the body temperature of those animals. So this is a temperature sensor which was recorded intravaginally of these cows. But you can see there that the actual elevated body temperature of the cows occurred during that time. Now, for those individual cows, what we can see there was that the calves born to those cows, what happened with the ones without the shade? So there was a significant difference of breed and shade. So the ability to withstand or tolerate the heat was associated with the provision of shade and breed for the growth of those calves within the first 14 days. Now, keeping in mind that the THIs we're talking about is around the 79, 80 mark, which you can see here on the graph, a 79 THI is essentially a 30-degree day with about 55% humidity. So not something really out of the ordinary for what our conditions are in Australia. So this is the slide that I'm showing now is actually from a weather station that we have currently running. But the top graph here is some temperature humidity index. So if we're talking about 79, just where my cursor is at the top, we exceed that every year, essentially, or we have done in the last few
Kieran, we
years.
can't see your cursor
Can't
moving,
see that.
and we're still on the coffee 2 extremes in respiration rate slide. Not sure if you've...
What's going on there then? Moved here.
Did not move here. We might be able to get the slides that up through our host if you send them there. Will's just suggested that if you stop sharing and then share again, it might change.
Sorry about that.
All fine. I will encourage people to put some Q&A questions and use that opportunity to either tell a story about what they may have seen, certainly in the producers that I've met with across regions in the Northern Territory. They've been happy enough and willing to share events where there's been extreme events that have affected cattle. Okay, we're back on, Kieran.
We're back on. Can you see the cursor there now? Maybe not.
Yeah, oh yeah, just briefly, I think I saw something.
Just make your cursor bigger, Kieran. It's just a bit small.
So I should be drawing on it now if you can see that. But anyway, the point is that we're getting high heat load events pretty commonly, generally annually. Now, on the top was temperature humidity index. The middle graph is the heat load index, which John spoke about. And the bottom graph is essentially, or is, accumulated heat load. So this is in February 2020. There was an extreme weather event there, whereas essentially there's an accumulation of heat. And again, in 2021, in February, there was a high heat load event. And in January 22, we didn't really see as extreme. But what we can see is if we are using a cut point of 96 for a heat load index, we do frequently incur higher heat load events. So what we're seeing, this is some data back. Now I'm switching over to some of the data that we've been using and receiving from our research. The first table on the top here is actually based on some observations that were done at Gatton. And there's the point I'm showing here is that the changes in grazing behaviour and occurring, you would recall that John said that heat stresses or heat load responses from cattle are usually a reduction in feed intake or grazing behaviour. So this research is showing, which these are preliminary results. So now, if you've got consecutive days exceeding 34 degrees, the time the cattle were spending out in the open was decreasing, and the time they spent grazing during the day was also decreasing. We also see from other parts of our research that as the heat load index was increasing, cattle were spending more time and at the trough, at the water drinking trough, and also they were increased bouts of drinking. All stuff that we generally know of. So the reason the project that I'm going to talk about today is and its impact on calf loss. Now, I spoke about the work that the Brazilians did, and there was the only significant response they observed was the growth of calves or the nutrition of calves during that at-risk period straight after birth. In a large study we did in the early 2000s, we observed between a 4 to 7% difference in pregnancy to weaning in the cash cow study when for cows that were getting born in months that had a high occurrence of days above 79 degrees, a temperature index of 79. So essentially, this is the point I'm trying to make, is that what we know is that calves are born, or majority of our calf deaths are occurring straight at the time, very close to the time of birth. And so within 5 days, about 2/3 of the deaths are occurring within that period. So that's the dramatic or a very focal point for if we're going to have an intervention or an impact on calf survival. We feel that that's a period that we need to focus on and prevent, and also that intervention needs to occur prior to that time. So the study that I was involved on was whether or not if we provided artificial shade in some of these paddocks with relatively few trees, whether or not that was an effective way to improve calf survival rates. So this work was done on Barclay Tableland with support of MLA, NT Department, and Australian Agricultural Company. And so what was achieved here was shade structures were installed within a couple of 100 meters of every water point, and they were grazed by pregnant heifers. And there was one paddock that was equipped with these artificial shade structures near the watering point, and another paddock that wasn't. These paddocks were comparable as possible, and the study was conducted over 3 years, and we compared the fetal and calf loss rates. The figure I'm showing here on the right is the top is the weather station or the weather information that we were receiving underneath one of the shade shelters, and then the bottom one is the information that we were getting external to the shade shelter. So the point here is that if these shade shelters were being utilised by the cattle, they did have the ability to mitigate a lot of their accumulated heat load if they spent enough time on there. So in the appreciated time, I'll just get straight to the results. Overall, we observed a 5% or nearly a 6% difference in pregnant cows producing a weaner. But due to the nature of this is a pilot study, and because of it wasn't replicated on multiple stations and things like that, this result was not found to be statistically significant, and we would be keen to do further work on this. But these are the results that we did observe in this study, and we continue to work with AAK around this. So what we did find, though, and why we didn't think what we did find also is that the grazing behaviour of the cattle changed during those high heat load events. But one of the reasons why we felt that this method was did not change or didn't have as much of an impact on calf survival was that around the time of the calving, cows generally isolate themselves away from the broader group, and the figure on the right is demonstrating the fluorescent marks is actually where the cows were spending their time at the time of calving, and you can see there that the majority of the cattle were actually away from where the shade shelters were around their time of calving. So we are keen to keep on researching this and looking at the changes in animal behaviour associated with this. The other confounding thing in this study is that so far we haven't accounted for some of the natural shade, even though it was quite minor in these paddocks. We do appreciate also that installing shade structures is quite an expensive option, and people would need to consider where they are in their development phase and make some effective or balance up the decision when they make the decision if they're going to go down that pathway or not. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Kieran. That was great. And thanks to all our speakers today. We have now time for questions, and we have one question I'll start off with, but I do again encourage everyone to post a question in either the Q&A or the chat, and we will get started. So the first question is potentially for you, John, and it's, can cattle be impacted by heat in spring like summer? And is the sudden drops of temperature in early autumn likely to have an impact?
So the early onset of like a spring heat event is probably worse than a summer one, because cattle haven't had time to do any adaptation to the hot conditions yet. So if we go down to places like Victoria, which is a long way from where most of you are, but 28 degrees can be a heat wave in October, because the cattle have come out of such cool conditions. So some of our worst heat events that have happened have come out of those cooler periods going into warmer conditions, but it also has a big production hit. So that's one issue. Going from warmer conditions into cooler conditions, probably not going to have a big impact unless the cattle are in poor conditions, and you've got some of those other factors like high wind and rain and mud and that sort of stuff compounding on it. But definitely the early heat waves can be bad.
Okay, thank you. And I was going to ask this of both, or I suppose the whole panel, and as well if anybody has experience with this, but in some of the producers I've been speaking to in regards to chill events that have occurred, they've said that this NACP product, the 7-day forecast, if we can have trust in that forecast to certainly predict chill events, then they would certainly use that forecast to do things such as send their cattle into different paddocks that were more treed so that they could take shelter, because they have had experiences where, the older cattle have survived and they kind of know where to go, whereas the little ones, even in good body condition, haven't quite made it through some of these chill events. So, are there any management practices that you would suggest for either heat or chill events if we had that forecast trust and people started using this product?
Who wants to go first, Meg? My gut feeling is that the cool events are probably going to be more of an impact on cattle in the north than the heat, but that's just my personal opinion. As far as what you can do, providing you've got enough time, and you can put trust in a 7-day forecast, either for heat or cold. I mean, you can make some management decisions. It's obviously difficult on extensive properties to do a lot of those things. The more intensive you are, the easier it is to do. But there can be some things done in terms of moving livestock, even postponing AI programs for heifer groups and things like that can be can be done. If you think these events are going to come through, they're going to have a big impact on, particularly on reproductive performance. Short term, it's difficult. Long term, I mean, there could be management changes in the long term around, do you change your breeding cycle? Again, difficult to do. You can make sure you've got enough nutrition out there for animals if they are going to get stuck in a paddock where they're likely not to get out because it's too wet. Can you get feed resources into them and those sort of things? So yeah, it's a really difficult one. And again, there's no single answer because it's almost going to be property specific. And it depends on where the cows are on the property as well. I mean, for the cattle, it could be option A might work if they're up in the northern paddocks, and option B might be the best way if they're down the southern paddocks. So yeah, there's lots of work to do in this space.
I was going to suggest another one would be in terms of looking at that forecast for, extreme heat and seeing maybe 2 or 3 days during the daytime temperatures and planning some activities around that. I mean, would you see impacts on cattle if you're going to move them from one paddock and muster and bring them into yards and maybe do things like castration and branding and, would you potentially plan different days for that? Is that likely to impact cattle if I'm doing those activities that are already stressful on the animal?
I mean, it would definitely have an impact on them, and if you could do that, it would be beneficial. And I do know of one producer in the north that changed their castration times this year last year to get around the heat, but they had time to do it. Yeah.
Kieran?
I think it's also subtle changes. I mean, if for cool snaps, I mean, one of the practical ways, if you've got cattle in yards, is make sure they've got plenty of feed. I know that sounds really simple, but cattle consuming good amounts of feed and things like that. So if you've in bigger stations that might have walked a while and not had a full grazing day and then going into yards and things like that, there's been cases where you get those cold snaps that knocks them around that way. But if you know that one of those things events are coming and you haven't got the ability to change dates, making sure that cattle have access to good water and feed and things like that, the practical things, is going to help you out.
Yeah, it's a good point with the water, Kieran, because there's often not a lot of water space. Animals yarded for a while, particularly during heat.
Would you also suggest, Kieran, that through your work and the work of others, that potentially moving pregnant cows who are about to calve into paddocks that have more shelter? I know that you said that it's kind of inconclusive, but is it looking that way?
Yeah, so I mean, all those practical things, I think the area research is really quite interesting in the fact that we don't know how applicable a lot of these thresholds are into the beef grazing situation, and we're, that's the work essentially, is to achieve improvements of different classes of livestock and what their susceptibility and things is. There's also huge variation between animals. So, even if you've got breed differences, you usually have between animal differences within that breed. And that allows us potentially and opens up the door for genetic selection for more tolerant or suitable animals. But I think it just comes down to practicality. If you've got an at-risk animal, if you've got guinea heifers, or like heifer versus cow, that is an at-risk group, and you had the choice between a vegetated paddock and a not vegetated paddock, for a group of cows that were going to calve outside the heat load period, well, you would assign a paddock according to that risk. So, I think that would be the practical way to go.
And I guess there's another question, and I'll just add one after this as well, which is, are there any concerns around the genetics of, the cattle moving further north as we see increases in temperature from your point of view, John?
Short answer is yes. So if we put more susceptible cattle into those environments, then there is that risk. Yeah.
Will
And
we
again,
likely,
it may not be a death risk, but it could be a reduction in performance risk.
are we
particularly
likely
in
to see
males.
Brahman around southern Queensland, pure Brahmans
Yep.
in the future? And the final question that we have on the Q&A is, should we be worried about nighttime temperatures or just daytime temperatures when we're looking at the heat for cattle?
Nighttime, very important. It's a big driver particularly in feedlot mortalities. If we don't get those temperatures down at night, the cattle cannot dissipate that heat out. And they've got two choices the next day. They either stop eating to try to maintain that heat. And if you get that accumulated heat going, then 3 or 4 or 5 days of accumulated heat, they cannot dissipate that heat. That's when you run the risk of mortalities. So nighttime temperature is quite important.
Yeah, and we saw that for the last year's January 2024 Australia Day weekend heatwave event in southeast Queensland. So that, in terms of maximum temperatures, so daytime temperatures, they weren't record breaking. They were hot, obviously, but it was the nighttime temperatures that were record breaking, and combined with the humidity, which is why we saw the mortality in the feedlots.
The other thing to consider with that too is that typically humidity goes up at night as temperatures drop a bit if you're in a humid environment. And cattle being respirators, they need to lose moisture either through sweating or panting. And so if the humidity's up and temperature's up, you don't get that gradient between the animal and the environment, so they just don't lose the heat.
I can add a couple of comments that sort of along that. Completely agree with what's just been said. What we're also seeing is these are some preliminary results, but cattle may not change their grazing time, but what they'll like over a whole 24-hour period. But what they are doing is they're changing when they're grazing. So they're changing at night time. Now, when it comes down to, so that means that an animal's innately able to, got some inbuilt ability to resilience towards the heat. And we're actually seeing that those cows that are actually displaying more of that behavior actually have a slightly higher growth rate than the ones that weren't doing that. And if you go to some of the research coming out of the US, people like Jim Sprinkle and others, they say the cows that are grazing during the daytime, they might have a full grazing event during the daytime in a heat load event, but then they'll sit out for the next couple of days recovering from that event. So they're sort of like this inefficient grazer. So these are nuances, but it's that identifying those cows and removing them from the system or doing something different to them, within, even though we might be getting more susceptible breeds, we might be able to also work with those breeds and end up with a more suitable animal in those environments and get the best of both worlds.
Thank you, Kieran and John and Tim. We seem to have no more questions in the chat. I'll just have another little look. Yeah, as is posted, big thank you to everybody involved, Professor John Gaugham, Dr. Tim Cowan and Dr. Kieran McCosker. We really appreciate your time, and it seems like it's a very interesting area of research, one that's, there's a lot of interest and has potential impacts for long-term cattle production. So we probably should make sure that we're putting our efforts and research money into these areas. If you do need any more information, all of these speakers are happy to share. And as I've said, there is a survey that I'll send out with the recording, and I'm sure people are happy to share their slides as well. And we'll be in touch if you have any questions, and yeah, happy for you to feed into the research as it goes forward. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, bye, everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for attending.
Thank you.